Hello and welcome to this final session of What is the Bible and What's Inside. My name's Rory. I'm the minister of the Methodist Church in Haxby and Wigginton, and as well as part of a team in ministry at Central Methodist Church in York. Over the last over 8 sessions, this being the 9th, we've been taking a very brief overview of the Bible, looking at what it is, how it came to be the way that it is, who we think wrote it and when, and what their intentions might have been. We've looked at it as a piece of literature, as well as through the lens of faith, and asked how we might expect it to speak into the church's life today. I haven't given any specific ideas about that in terms of what should be the case in terms of how we read the Bible or what we expect from it, but I've tried to give an overview of the way that it's been used as a text, as a library of 66 books spanning thousands of years of Israelite and then early Christian history, to try and help us get some sense of what we can expect from it, what's in it, how historically accurate it is, as well as to try and meet the people who both write the books we have, as well as the people who are featured in the stories, and how they view the world and what that tells them about God and themselves, about their neighbors, about their enemies, about what it means for them to be somehow connected to God in the midst of their lives. And today we look at the very last book in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, or to give it its proper title, the Revelation of John or the Revelation to John. A book that is either on one end of the scale an historically or prophetically accurate description of what in Christian language is called eschatology, end times. It either on that end of the scale tells us exactly how we think the end of the world will come about and God will reappear and all things will be made new, or on the very other end of the scale, a deeply problematic and confusing piece of literature that is full of symbolic imagery, full of language, full of symbolic numbers that either can be interpreted in all kinds of ways or whose interpretations may simply be lost to us, because we can't say that we know what the author's original intention was. So I want to spend a little bit of time today on the book of Revelation, and then a little bit of time summing up the series. And each of these videos is about half an hour, and today's will be about that length, perhaps a little shorter. So the Revelation of John is, as I've said already, the last of the books in the New Testament canon of Scripture. Canon just collection. It was the last to be included in some of the earliest collections of what is now the Christian Bible, which of course came into being over time through a series of conversations and councils across the early church for the first 4 to 5 centuries of its life. Revelation is the last of those to be included. In terms of authorship, it's ascribed traditionally to John, to the author of John, and if we hold the traditional authorship, which again I've described in the lesson or the session about the Gospels, is problematic, then the Apostle John, the disciple John, who wrote the book of John, also wrote this, and wrote it in exile on the island of Patmos. That's how the author introduces themselves, John of Patmos. And we don't know. We don't know exactly who wrote it, but we think, based on the references that are found in it, that it was written in the late 1st century, so not very different to the times around which the Gospels themselves were being written. What purpose does it serve? Well, for some people, as I've said already, it serves the purpose of giving us an apocalyptic vision of the future. Apocalyptic not necessarily meaning disastrous, although it's quite difficult to read, but just in terms of a great revelation, that all of God will be revealed, and these events, these creatures, this journey that we see laid out in the book of Revelation, culminating in the creation of a new heaven and a new earth, and the restoration of all that was. Almost a return to Eden, if we want to bookend that with the again either historically accurate or mythical beginnings of the book of Genesis, trying to explain how we got here in the first place and came to be as we are. So there's no evidence that whoever wrote the book of Revelation had access to any of the Gospels or the early letters that were written before the Gospels, as I've explained in a previous session already. The Old Testament, the New Testament letters that follow the Gospels and Acts are actually older than the Gospels themselves. But there is quite a lot of reference to passages in the Old Testament, particularly passages from Daniel and Ezekiel, from Psalms, from Isaiah, with Daniel coming to the fore because Daniel is the chapter in the Old Testament that has the most obviously prophetic literature built into it. So the book of Revelation begins with 7 letters to 7 churches across Asia Minor. And they're not letters that were sent out in that way, but the author writes 7 sections of paragraphs to each of those churches, most of which are deeply critical of their life in some way, as well as having sections in them that praise them for their steadfastness and for the things that they have done that are part of the author's vision of how the gospel will be realized and lived out in the world. It used to be predominantly thought that the book of Revelation was written almost to comfort Christians who were being persecuted under the evils of the Roman Empire. But that view has been revised. The Roman Empire was not violent towards Christianity all the time. It was an accommodating and quite egalitarian society, as long as Roman rules were kept, most of which meant paying your taxes and not rebelling. If that was the case, there wasn't throughout the Roman Empire the imposition of the worship of foreign gods upon the Jewish or Christian people. There was a great degree of freedom for people to go about their lives as subjects of the Roman Empire, but not subject to it in every single detail of their lives. They found themselves subjects of an empire rather than sort of slaves within a great domineering culture that was headed up by a despot. And so we're not sure how to read Revelation in terms of what it's meant to do, who it's for, and what it's meant to say to them. The view was that it was, as I said a moment ago, originally written to comfort Christians persecuted in Asia Minor. But then we know that some of the emperors around that time, Domitian and others, were, as I've said already, acted quite favorably towards Christians and gave an enormous amount of freedom to people to go about their private and worshipping lives as long as they remained subject to Rome. It's more likely that the book of Revelation is about the Christian people's identity separate from the Roman Empire and the extent to which they take part in or go along with this both foreign culture and foreign set of religions. There's an element in it of the question of how far civil obedience or disobedience extends with regards to being in the pocket of a subjugating and essentially dominating empire that the Roman Empire was, for those who were receiving, in whatever form, we don't know, receiving the book of Revelation as something to read, to study, to share, to spend some time with. We don't know who it's for or why it was written. We can say it was for Christians in the Roman Empire around the end of the 1st century, but we don't know what the intention of the author was, and there's some dispute about that in terms of how they were trying to speak to Christian communities about their place within the Roman Empire. So towards the end of the 4th century, as the Bible becomes more solidified into the form we have it today, there are the first inklings of Revelation being considered canonical, being included into the canon of Scripture. We then have, right through the next 1,000 years, the use of this letter in church settings. We're not sure exactly how it would have been used, but it was certainly part of the Scriptures. Then we have Martin Luther, who comes along and in the course of the Reformation takes a very low view of some books in the Bible, the letter of James, for example, and also the book of Revelation, which he considered neither apostolic nor prophetic. He didn't consider it to be either historically or prophetically accurate in terms of the way that it went about explaining something of God to the people who were reading it. So there's a pattern to the 7 letters written to the 7 churches. And that pattern, broadly speaking, across all of those letters, as brief as they are, is that they are praised and then admonished. Praised and then admonished. They are promised reward for their faithfulness to the gospel and to Jesus, and then they're admonished for something that is part of their particular expression, perhaps, of their kind of subjecting themselves and subverting themselves and giving themselves over, it would seem in the eyes of the author, to the Greco-Roman Empire, Greco-Roman culture. It's quite clear that the Revelation is written again in the understanding that Jesus is about to return, that the return of Jesus, which is called the second coming, the parousia, is imminent. And so they are particularly to be vigilant and particularly to be clear about the distinctions between themselves and the Roman Empire, the Greco-Roman Empire, culture that they find themselves living under. What follows on from the 7 letters is a very detailed set of very imaginative and mystical images of seals being opened that are part of the horsemen of the apocalypse appearing. That there are trumpets that sound. There are spiritual figures, 7 of each of these, of course, and 7 is a significant number in Scripture and in many cultures and in many mythologies, and many understandings of God. 7 bowls of torment and punishment are poured out upon the earth. And then towards the end of Revelation, we have the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is about the culmination of the life of Jesus in his love for the church and for all that it might be. There is final judgment of beasts, dragons, judgments of the dead, judgments of symbolic figures that many people say directly we can ascribe to the either mythical or real figure of Satan and devils and demons and people who've made poor choices in their lives, that the final reckoning takes place. And then we come to the end of Revelation, which is where we spend most of our time when we read it. We don't read much between the 7 letters and the end. But we find in the very last chapter of Revelation a very hopeful image emerging, the image of a new heaven and a new earth to replace the old heaven and the old earth, God coming to dwell with humanity in Jerusalem, God permanently present with all of humankind, a description of that New Jerusalem and what that New Jerusalem looks like and feels like, and then the image of the river of life and the tree of life that are part of the symbolic imagery of that perpetual union with a God who is present in peace and in love. I'm not going to go into much great detail. In fact, I'm not going to go into detail at all in any attempt to unpack the seals, the trumpets, the spiritual figures, the bowls, the way that through a series of visions, the author of the Revelation tells us God pours out judgment upon the earth. God brings final awareness to people of their sinfulness and of the fact that God is God. And if you want to read them all, then make of them what you will. Revelation is 21 chapters. It's quite a long book. But it certainly fires the imagination if you want to spend some time with it. I finish in terms of thinking about Revelation where I started. There are some Christians, many Christians, who believe that the book of Revelation, in their view of the Bible as an inerrant and accurate depiction of all that God has been, is, and will be in the future, would see it as a prophetic telling of events that are to come in our lives. For many other Christians, that is deeply problematic because there is no image that really chimes in Revelation with the God of love and grace and forgiveness. It does sound like God wreaking final vengeance upon all of God's enemies, again and again through the book. And so we need to make of it what we will. Some people become very anxious about the book of Revelation as part of their faith because they think it describes both times of great testing and in the letters to the churches and the things that they are told they have done well and should do differently. There are great lines drawn in the sand as to who will escape this great tribulation that is to come and who will be included in it, who will have God's favor and who won't. But as a piece of literature, it's fascinating. It's a fascinating study of somebody's vision of what it means to remain true to God in the midst of a huge dominant culture that is understood to be about to come to an abrupt and dramatic end, and the way that God will be with those who are steadfast in the midst of that and through that. If you want to spend some time with the book of Revelation, then by all means just read it as it is. There are some useful resources online to understand it. If you want an overview of the structure of it and really what's in it in the way that I've described it, then again the Wikipedia page on the Revelation of John, or the book of Revelation, is a helpful starting place, as well as searches for phrases like eschatology, all of which are linked through that, our understanding of end times and people's use of these passages, to try and understand what it means to live in a finite world that has a beginning and an end. I hope this has been a good series for you. I hope that, it hasn't been scholarly because I'm not a biblical scholar, so I haven't tried to pretend that I am. What I have tried to do through all of it is to give you, as I said at the beginning of this session, an overview of the whole of the Bible, and not just what's in it, but how it came to be ordered into the sections that it is in, because it is definitely ordered into sections right through the Old Testament and then into the New Testament. We have definite sections of Scripture. So it's not written in a linear fashion, chronologically. We don't have the events all proceeding in the same order. We have in the Old Testament, as we have in the Gospels, in Kings and Chronicles and 1 and 2 Samuel. We have some stories told a number of times from a different perspective, with a different emphasis by a different author. We have poetry, we have song, we have lament, we have the whole range of human emotion and the whole range of human experience. We have 4 different versions, although 3 of them bear enormous similarities between themselves in the Gospels. 4 different tellings of the story of the life of Jesus, up to the point of his death and resurrection. We have letters, personal letters written to individual churches and individual people as the early church formed and found its way in all kinds of competing and dominant cultures across Asia Minor. And we have, as we've come to today, the book of Revelation. The Bible is deeply problematic. It is not easy to read, and it's not easy to understand. And one of the great sadnesses of Scripture is that it seems like people within the church and outside of it have a tendency to selectively lift out a particular passage that suits their argument, whether that be about human sexuality, about violence, about the place of women in the church, about almost anything. Even those who want to dispute and refute and bash the Christian faith and the Christian church. It is very easy to find passages in the Bible that on their own depict God as, frankly, abhorrent in terms of God's behavior, God's capricious nature, God's vengeful nature, God's the things God asks people to do, sacrifice their children, even just the floods of Egypt, the plagues of Egypt, a story of a God who inflicts enormous suffering on people who are subjects of an empire, not those who are necessarily in charge of it. The Bible is problematic. It's also fascinating. It's fascinating because it is a complex and contradictory insight into people's perceptions of God, themselves, each other. As I've said already, they're strangers and enemies, women, children, the nature of place as identity, both in the nation of Israel and then locally in local communities, the establishment of temples, altars, formal religious worship, scholarship around that, people set aside to be scholars and essentially monks and priests within within orders. It is a I won't say it's quite a romp, but it is certainly a fascinating window into thousands of years of a nation and then a faith's attempt to find God and explain God and express God and tell the story of God for themselves and to each other in a way that endures today. We can be quite sure that none of the books that we find in the Bible were written for a 21st century church in the United Kingdom or anywhere else in the world necessarily. These books endure because councils largely made up of men decided that these were the books that were going to be included, and so those decisions have been made. And as happens with decisions like that, for some people they'd say God guided those men just as much as God essentially guided the hands of those who wrote the scriptures in the first place. But things tend to find a way have a tendency to concretize themselves over time. And so that things we may have done even for 100 years in the church's life or another part of our country's life, they become part of who we are and we don't argue with them anymore. They become sacred. Sacred. They tell us who we are, and they tell us who we are in the presence of God. And so they are not to be done away with. Well, one of the things that anyone has to do when they come to the Bible, if they want to read it intelligently and they want to read it faithfully to the people who wrote it in the situations they were in, is to engage our mind and come with our questions. And where we need to even be deeply skeptical of some of the things the Bible tells us about God, about human beings, about the historical nature of events. Those are all valid ways, a valid part of coming at the attempt to have to express faith or to understand faith or to understand the faiths of other people as they have lived them. The Bible is not God, and it does seem as though some people have confused that a little bit because they've made the Bible untouchable, beyond criticism, beyond the fact of it being collections of writings on the pages of books that are no different than any other books that we have in terms of the fact of what they are. People who have placed these stories on a pedestal to the point where they cannot be engaged with intellectually, they cannot be engaged with critically, they cannot be engaged with in order to learn just as much about how the authors may have got things wrong as how they got them right, so that we might make better choices in our lives about the way we tell our histories, the way we talk about God, the way we organize ourselves, the way we engage with today, the way we think about yesterday, and the way we prepare for tomorrow. I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you have any comments or any questions that have been raised through the course of the series that you'd like to see unpacked in further sessions online or otherwise, you're very welcome to let me know. The whole point of doing this series of talks, much the same as anything else I've done during coronavirus, and putting those online, has been to generate conversation. So if there's conversation you'd like to have, or a topic you'd particularly like to have unpacked, then please let me know, because I am planning to do more of things like this into the future. Maybe not series quite as long, but even if there are individual topics, let me know. I'll be more than happy to have a think about offering those. In the meantime, if you do read the Bible, keep reading it, keep scratching your head, keep being puzzled by it, keep being affirmed by it, keep being horrified by it. Keep your heart and your mind in the exploring of what it means for you to be you, and to learn some of what that means from the stories of other people. What it means for God to be God, as you conceive of God, or struggle with God, the idea of God, or have found yourself at peace in the idea of God, the experience of God. The Bible offers us timeless stories that are from a particular time that we try to learn from today, as we ask what it means to be exploring both ourselves and the possibility of God in the world today. So I've prattled on for long enough again, and I'm going to stop now, other than to say again, thank you for taking part, thank you for watching, and if there's anything you want to talk more about, then please let me know.